This podcast may not be suitable for young listeners.
Chapter 5, Lambs to the Slaughter. A wolf doesn't concern himself with the opinions of sheep. Writer unknown. Will decelerated as he rounded the last bend in the road on State Highway D. Up ahead he could see flashing lights of several Cameron County cruisers. They were directing traffic away from the house that was surrounded with crime scene tape. Everything in the driveway to the small shed behind the house was included inside the tape. It was lit up with 3 large security lights that had been installed around the house. "This looks like the place," muttered Blanchard. "Unless they found another one," added Will. "Well, let's hope not," replied Blanchard. 2 scenes are already bad enough. We got to figure out what's happening and stop it. Slowing to stop, a uniformed deputy motioned for them to roll down the window. And holding up his badge and credentials as he cranked the window down, Will nodded to the deputy. "Detectives Gragel and Blanchard," said Will. "Lackland County." "We've been expecting you, sir," replied the young deputy whose name tag said Ramirez. "Detective Weddle is standing over there by the fence." Will glanced in the direction that the deputy was pointing and saw a man in his mid-40s with thinning brown hair, wearing a thick leather coat over khaki pants and tactical boots. A large gold badge hung around his neck by a silver chain. He was smoking and looking toward them. Pulling into the driveway, Will shut the engine down and stepped out of the car. Blanchard grabbed the black duffel bag from the back seat and joined them. Crushing out a cigarette, Weddle stepped toward them and extended his hand as he approached. "Jack Weddle," he said. "Thank you for coming." Will grasped his hand and shook it firmly. Weddle had a strong handshake, and Will instantly liked that about him. "Will Gragel," he answered. "This is my partner, Mike Blanchard." "How you doing?" asked Mike, not reaching for his offered hand. "I've been better," replied Weddle, frowning at the slight. "I hope you boys haven't eaten recently. This is the worst crime scene I've ever seen." "Oh, that's great," muttered Blanchard, shaking his head. "How many people have been inside?" asked Will. "One deputy, long enough to verify there was a crime scene," explained Weddle, "and he went outside and puked, and then he called us. I looked in through the back door and sealed the scene. That's when I called you." "Yeah, about that," said Blanchard. "Why toss us this hot potato?" "Because I think it's related to your scene," said Weddle. "I figured the fresher the scene, the better chance you guys have to connect the two." "So you think that whoever murdered the couple in Lebanon did this as well?" asked Blanchard. "I think that it's not going to take more than a glance inside this house to decide that this is not done by a man," said Weddle. "Nothing human did that to these people." "How many people?" asked Will. "Honestly," replied Weddle, shaking his head, "we're not sure." "Just to be clear," said Will, frowning, "are you requesting us to look, or are you giving us the scene entirely?" "This is going to start a panic when it hits the news," said Weddle. "I don't give a damn whose case it is. We got to stop it from happening again." "All right," said Will. "I'm going to make the initial assessment, and then I'm going to loop you in on our findings. Blanchard, will you go interview the deputy who first arrived at the scene?" "If that means I don't have to go inside, then hell yes, I'll interview him," replied Blanchard. "Good," replied Will. "Show me the exact route that the deputy took to approach the scene." "His vehicle is still parked right where it was," explained Weddle. "He approached the front door and knocked, and when he didn't get an answer, he walked around to the south side of the house and found the back door open. As soon as he glanced inside, he drew his weapon and stepped in the door. And once he saw the condition of the place, he ran back to the door and threw up all over by the propane tank." "Okay," said Will. "I'm going inside." "We haven't seen any movement," said Weddle, "but no one has cleared the house." Thanks for the heads up, replied Will. I seriously doubt that whatever did this is anywhere near here now. Still, everyone should stay alert just in case. If you hear gunshots, come running. Will began making his way to the back of the house. He wasn't concerned with checking the front door since the attack had come through the back. Moving slowly, he could see the impressions of tactical boots in the frozen ground. As he rounded the corner to the back, he froze. That all too familiar smell played on the air. It was faint, but still recognizable as the same scent he'd smelled at the first crime scene. It still inspired fear on an instinctual level. This was unmistakably a large predator. "Whatever you are," whispered Will, frowning, "you aren't human. There's no mistaking it now." Will glanced around the area before proceeding further. He took in the proximity of the tree line to the back of the house, the size of the fence that ran across the backyard, and the most likely routes of approach. He could see the faint impressions in the grass from behind the small well house at the back of the property, and from there he could see the shortest route from the trees to the well house. "That's how you got here," whispered Will, "but where did you go?" The only tracks he could see were approaching the back of the house. There were no tracks leading away from the house. That meant it had found another way out of the house, or it was still inside. "Shit," whispered Will, drawing his Hellcat X2 and thumbing the safety off. Moving slowly back toward the others, he kept his pistol trained on the back door and waited until he was clear of the nearest window before turning around. He moved quickly back to the Charger and opened the trunk. Removing his pea coat, he slipped into the olive drab plate carrier with sheriff emblazoned across the front and back. Once the Velcro was in place, he picked up his Kel-Tec KSG 12-gauge shotgun and checked the load. The twin tubes were loaded with alternating rifled tactical slugs and double-aught buckshot. "What's going on?" asked Weddle as he trotted up to the car. "I think it's still here," replied Will. "Are you serious?" asked Weddle. "All this time?" "I only saw tracks approaching the house," said Will. "Not leaving, so yeah, it might still be inside." "Shit," hissed Weddle, sprinting for the back of his own car. In seconds, Weddle was putting on his own tactical vest and pulled out his patrol rifle. Will motioned for Blanchard to load up and join him. To his credit, Mike didn't argue. He just unzipped the duffel bag and started slipping into his own gear. "Have 2 deputies watch the front door," Will said, heading for the back of the house. "The rest of you, stack up behind me. We're going in." Blanchard fell in right behind Will, with Weddle next and Deputy Ramirez bringing up the rear. Ramirez and Weddle both had patrol rifles, and Blanchard had his department-issued Remington 870 Police Magnum 12-gauge. While it was not ideal, it was what they had to work with, and they were going to make it work. "If this thing is still inside," Will called back over his shoulder, "shoot to kill. Do not hesitate, because whatever can do this to people certainly won't hesitate before killing us." "Copy that," replied Blanchard. "I'll take it you're no longer entertaining the idea that this is a man?" "You saw the first scene," replied Will. "What do you think?" "Damn," replied Blanchard. "I never thought it was a man. I just never thought I'd see a live grizzly in Missouri. At least not outside of the damn zoo." Moving up to the back of the house, Will lined up the stack at the edge of the back porch. "On my signal," he whispered. "Ready," replied Weddle. Just as Will was about to give the go command, they heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering from around the house, immediately followed by gunfire. "It's exiting the front," roared Weddle. Instantly, they broke formation and headed around the house as fast as they could go. Will easily outdistanced everyone except Ramirez. As they were heading for the front, they heard a scream that ended in a blood-curdling gurgle. Now they could only hear one pistol firing. Fueled with adrenaline, Will charged ahead of Ramirez and rounded the corner onto the front yard. Time seemed to freeze as his mind fought to comprehend what he was seeing. There, before him, he saw the bloody carnage that was left of one of the two deputies. His head was nearly torn from his shoulders, and there was blood everywhere. The second deputy was continuing to fire at the creature that was running incredibly fast, bearing down on him with the intensity of a freight train. Will brought his Keltec up to his shoulder and squeezed the trigger. The thunderous roar of the shotgun pierced the tableau, and Will could see the buckshot hit the target. And behind him, he heard the report of a patrol rifle. Ramirez had joined the fight. In the instant that this all took place, Will took in the details with a calm detachment. It all seemed utterly surreal. His conscious mind was rebelling against what he was seeing because only the primitive part of his being accepted it. There was a large creature covered completely in black fur running on two legs. It stood well over 7 feet tall and it looked like a massive wolf, only it wasn't running on all fours. Working the pump of his shotgun, he prepared to fire again when the creature slid to the right slightly as it shot past the second deputy. In a flash, it slashed across the face with a savage right hand. The massive claws cut deep furrows into his face and exposed throat. The deputy fell gurgling to the ground, his Glock pistol falling from nerveless fingers. "What the hell is that?" screamed a voice. Will's primitive brain only distantly heard the voice, but somehow recognized it as Blanchard. Firing again, he could see the big rifle slug slam into the creature's back, causing it to lurch to the side and begin to fall. Before it impacted with the ground, it put its hands out and caught itself, without effort switching from running on 2 legs to running on all 4s. More gunshots erupted from behind him, but Will was completely focused on the creature. It moved impossibly fast into the trees and was instantly swallowed by the foreboding darkness of the forest. For a few seconds he could hear the beast crashing through the trees, but that too vanished, leaving behind an otherworldly silence that was broken only by the wet gurgling sounds of the dying deputy. Yanking open the small EDC trauma kit that he kept attached to his vest, he tore open the contents and began applying direct pressure to deep lacerations in the deputy's throat. "Mike!" screamed Will. "Get the big kit out of the charger!" "What the hell is that thing?" screamed Blanchard. "Just get the damn kit!" Will screamed back. "Ramirez, cover us in case that thing comes back." Will glanced up to see Ramirez take a protective stance near his left side while Weddle was calling into his radio for additional units and an ambulance. Glancing at the nameplate on the deputy's uniform, he saw that his name was McGregor. "Stay with me, McGregor," he said, trying his best to sound calm. "Focus on me, breathe deep and slow. You're going to be fine." Blanchard came running up, carrying the vehicle kit. "Get me all the hemostatic gauze you can," yelled Will without taking his eyes off McGregor. Already he could see the light beginning to fade in his eyes. "McGregor!" screamed Will. "Talk to me! Stay with me, man!" McGregor tried to focus on Will's face. Blanchard threw the gauze into McGregor's chest, and Will instantly began packing the wounds with it. I'm cold," he stammered. Blanchard ripped open the packet containing the Mylar blanket from the kit and wrapped it around the deputy's torso. "Looks like the bleeding is slowing," whispered Blanchard. Will only nodded. It remained to be seen if it was stopping because he controlled the bleed, or if it meant that McGregor was bleeding out. Watching carefully, he saw that McGregor's breathing was shallow but steady. "Mike," said Will, glancing up at him. "Get some gloves on. I need you to keep the pressure on this until the EMTs arrive." "Where are you going?" asked Blanchard, snapping the nitrile gloves in place. "I'm going to try to track that damn thing," explained Will, dark anger in his voice. "Don't you dare go after that fucking thing alone," snarled Mike. "He won't," answered Ramirez with a fierce look of determination on his face. "I'm going with him." Blanchard took over the pressure on the wound and Will stood up. "Watch his breathing," cautioned Will. "I think he's stabilized, but that's a nasty wound. If you take the pressure off, he'll bleed out in seconds." "Got it," replied Blanchard, keeping his attention focused on McGregor. Scooping up his KSG, he turned and headed to the last place he had seen the creature. Ramirez stayed with him. Will ignored the fact that his hands were covered with blood. He could feel it growing cold and sticky with each passing second. He didn't have time to worry about that. The trail was already growing colder. Clicking on the tactical light mounted on the side of the KSG, he began following the tracks and looking for blood drops. He knew that the creature had been hit several times, but he could find no signs of blood. There was a clear trail in the leaves and ground clutter, but that disappeared after about 30 yards. Will could see gouges in the bark of a big walnut tree where it had climbed rapidly into the canopy of the forest. Keeping the KSG up and ready, he circled slowly, looking from branch to branch. Using the tactical light, he began sweeping the treetops. Ramirez stayed almost back to back with him, scanning the area around them. After several long moments had passed, he began lowering the KSG. "It's gone," he said, dejected. "Can you track it?" asked Ramirez. "Not through the trees," he explained. "If it was on the ground, I'd track it till the ends of the earth. Whatever this thing is, it's damn smart." "Shit!" hissed Ramirez. "Let's get back to the others," replied Will. "There's nothing more we can do here." As they emerged from the trees, Will could already hear the approaching sirens. Down the road, he could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. 2 Cameron County patrol chargers and an ambulance roared into view. In seconds, they were pulled into the driveway and leaping from their vehicles. Weddle went over to the deputies and began talking to them. He gestured for the ambulance crew to head toward where Blanchard was still holding on to McGregor. It was only as they walked back into the yard that Will noticed the window that the creature had burst through before attacking the 2 deputies. It was on the 2nd floor. The thing had leapt from nearly 20 feet up, landing almost on top of the 1st deputy. "What the hell are you?" whispered Will. Will took the opportunity to clean the blood from his hands and the KSG while the ambulance crew took over care of McGregor. Within moments, they whisked him away and into the ambulance, and by the time it was backing out of the driveway, Will was drying his hands and reloading the expended rounds. "Nice work, detective," said Weddle, walking up and handing Will a cup of coffee and a thermos cup. "For what?" asked Will, taking the cup and sipping the bitter black liquid. "It wasn't good, but it was hot, and that was enough." "For saving McGregor's life," explained Weddle. "The crew said that if you hadn't done what you did, he'd be dead." "Well, he's not out of the woods yet," replied Will. "He's lost a lot of blood." "He's a tough kid," said Weddle, nodding toward the rapidly departing ambulance. "He'll make it. Where did you learn to treat wounds like that?" "Afghanistan," explained Will. "An old friend of mine taught me battlefield medicine." "How do we explain this?" asked Weddle, nodding at the now expanded crime scene. "We report the evidence," replied Will. "Nothing more, nothing less. You start processing the scene out here and I'll head inside the house." "Think that there's another one of those things in there?" asked Weddle. "Well, I hope not," answered Grey Eagle. "I'll take Blanchard in with me this time. The deputy he was supposed to interview's dead anyway." "How do I explain this to his family?" asked Weddle, his expression going dark. "Very gently," said Will. "You tell them that he died in an animal attack. Anything beyond that, tell them that the investigation is active and you can't give them a lot of details." "They're not going to like that," Weddle said, frowning. "They won't like the truth either," said Will with a shrug. "Even if you told them what you saw, would they believe it? Will anyone believe it?" "Probably not," Weddle said softly. "Then we stick to calling this an animal attack until we can either capture or kill that thing," explained Will. I know I hit that thing at least 4 times, said Weddle, and it just kept going. How many times did you hit it, or Blanchard, or Ramirez? I didn't find a blood trail, replied Will. I know I hit it clean, but I never found so much as a drop of blood. I can't explain that. If bullets don't stop it, said Weddle, then what does? I wish I had an answer for that, replied Will. I really do. Chapter 6. Charnel House. Words have no power to impress the mind without the exquisite horror of their reality. Edgar Allan Poe. It was after midnight by the time Will and Blanchard were making their way back to the Lackland County Sheriff's Office. They rode in silence until they were turning off the narrow county road and back onto Highway 5 south toward Lebanon. It was starting to snow and the clouds seemed to indicate it was going to be a good one. "What the fuck was that thing?" asked Blanchard without preamble, a note of fear still lingering in his voice. "I don't know," Will answered honestly. "I don't believe in ghost stories and shit like that," explained Blanchard, "but that thing looked like a fucking werewolf." "I thought they didn't exist," replied Will. 12 hours ago, so did I," retorted Blanchard. "What in the entire fuck was that thing? I mean, what else could it be?" "Mike, I want to tell you something, and I don't want to catch a bunch of shit about it, okay?" said Will, slowing the big Charger to just below the speed limit. "After what we just saw," said Blanchard, shaking his head, "what could you possibly say that would top that?" "My grandfather is a medicine man," explained Will. "He might know more about this than we're going to learn about in any book." "Makes about as much sense as anything I've seen today," Blanchard said, shaking his head. "Nothing about this makes sense," Will replied. "I never truly believed a lot of the tales of my people that I heard when I was a boy. At least I didn't until today." "Your people believe in werewolves?" asked Blanchard, glancing over at Will. "Not exactly," said Will, shaking his head. "There are legends of creatures like this, but not exactly werewolves. The Navajo call them skinwalkers." "I don't care what you call it," said Blanchard. "Does he know how we can kill it?" "Maybe," answered Will. "It's the only lead I can think to follow." "When do you want to go talk to him?" asked Blanchard. "Well, I'd go right now, but the sheriff is expecting a report," said Will. "I can give him the report," said Blanchard. "Just drop me off at the office and go see your grandfather. What do you want me to tell the sheriff?" "The creature approached the house from the trees on the east side of the property," explained Will. "It crouched behind the well house before being sensed by the family dog. It looked to be a German Shepherd mix. Either it was killed to keep it from alerting the family or just out of spite. Whichever way, the dog was torn to shreds, still attached to the thick chain, and from the look of it, the dog had been cowering inside the doghouse. It had been dragged out of the house and killed with brutal precision. The pieces of the dog showed no signs of being fed on." Will felt a twinge of remorse for the poor dog. It never stood a chance chained to that doghouse. It couldn't have escaped if it had tried. "4 victims in the initial crime scene," explained Will. 2 adults, 1 male and 1 female. One was an adolescent male, approximately 17 years old, and the last was a prepubescent female, approximately 10 years old. All had clearly been fed upon. Flashes of the crime scene passed through Will's mind. He remembered that the young female in the first crime scene had been sexually assaulted. That didn't seem to be the case this time. Only signs of feeding, and Will didn't share that detail with anyone. "The creature entered the house through the back door," added Will, his voice soft and detached. "There were claw marks near the door handle and more on the door frame. The door had been torn open using a tremendous amount of force. Will could see the deep gouges in the hard wood of the door frame. The door handle was bent, indicating a strong hand had tried to turn the handle, damaging the knob in the process. When the door wouldn't open, the creature threw its weight against it. The resulting force shattered the door and ripped the deadbolt out of the door frame. "The father appeared to have been killed in the kitchen," said Will, reciting his observations calmly. "It appeared that he had tried to defend the rest of the family. His head had been torn from his neck and his entrails scattered around the kitchen." Will saw the knife that was still clutched in the dead man's hand. The image faded as quickly as it appeared. "The mother and son tried to fight it as it entered the living room," said Will. "There was clearly a struggle. The son had been ripped open from the crotch to the throat. His left arm had been torn off and he was lying on top of an upright piano. There was a double-barrel shotgun laying beside the boy. Both barrels had been fired. The spent casings inside the shotgun were both number 7 birdshot. There was significant damage to the wall and door frame. From the pattern, it was clear that he hit the creature without causing much damage." Blanchard didn't interrupt. Although he had been there, it was amazing the level of detail that Will observed that he had overlooked. "The mother had her throat torn out near the bottom of the stairs," added Will. "She also had both of her arms torn out of their sockets and thrown across the room. There was a fireplace poker on the ground next to her. The poker bent almost in half. There were tufts of dark fur still stuck to the end of the poker. They're bagged for evidence." "I'll get those analyzed as fast as I can," replied Blanchard. "The little girl was different, though," said Will, as if Blanchard hadn't even spoken. "Approximately 10 years old, the creature tracked her to an upstairs closet. It had to rip through the door to get to her. It dragged her out of the closet and tore her throat out. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms. Both arms were broken and twisted, with bone protruding from the skin above the elbows." Will ran over the images of all 4 bodies in his mind. There was something there that just wouldn't go away. Some nagging part of the picture that he wasn't seeing. "What is it?" asked Blanchard. "You're on to something." "It's just something I can't quite put my finger on," replied Will. "Almost like there's a pattern to this." "To the attacks," said Blanchard excitedly. "No," said Will. "To the feeding. It was similar on all the victims that had been fed on." "Well, what do you mean?" Blanchard asked, frowning. "Why attack that many people at all?" mused Will. "There isn't any way that one creature could eat all of them, not quickly anyway." "Then what?" demanded Blanchard. "Why feed a little off each one?" "Well, that's the thing," explained Will. "It only ate pieces from certain areas." "What areas?" asked Blanchard. "I didn't really see a feeding pattern in all that damage." "There is a distinct difference between wounds from an attack and feeding," explained Will. "The majority of the wounds were defensive wounds. It was only after they died that it came back and fed. It fed very selectively, only in certain spots on each victim." "So it has favorite bits to chew on," said Blanchard. "Well, what does that mean?" "It's like when you field dress a deer," said Will. He froze for a moment and shook his head. "Holy shit," he exclaimed. "That's exactly what it's like. This isn't random feeding. The portions that were torn out and devoured were sweetbreads and backstraps and tenderloin." "The what?" asked Blanchard. "I forget you're not a hunter, Mike," said Will. "They're the best cuts of the deer, the most flavor and the most coveted by hunters." "Well, what does that mean?" demanded Blanchard. "I don't get it." "That means that this thing is far smarter than we thought," replied Will. "This is not typical predator behavior. Only man does this." "I thought we agreed that this thing is no man," said Blanchard, looking even more confused than before. "It isn't," Will answered. "Not really, but it's not a typical animal either. It's intelligent enough to select the cuts of meat that it wants to eat. That's why it was still there. It takes time to cut those specific pieces out. I know it does on a deer anyway, and I can only assume it's the same on a human." "The sheriff can fucking wait," said Blanchard. "Let's go see your grandfather right now." "No," replied Will. "Let's go back to the office and file our reports. I'll go see my grandfather afterward. He won't talk about any of this in front of someone he doesn't know. All right, fine, said Blanchard, but I want to know what he says as soon as you get back. That's a deal, replied Will. Damn, said Blanchard, shaking his head. It's damn near 1 o'clock. My wife's going to kill me for missing dinner. Yeah, replied Will, it is getting late. Let's get some rest and file the reports in the morning. By the time I got out to my grandfather's place, he'd long since be in bed. It's better to wait until the morning before I head out there. Those roads are bad even during the weather. Well, I just hope that goddamn thing doesn't attack anyone else tonight, said Blanchard, frowning. Yeah, me too, answered Will. Chapter 7. Elder Council. Beware of the man who does not talk, and the dog that does not bark. Cheyenne. After finishing his official report from the crime scene, Will leaned back in his battered desk chair and steepled his hands on his chest. There was no mention of anything paranormal in the report. He did mention that the official cause of death would have to be determined by the county coroner, but it was likely some sort of animal attack. As unsatisfied as he was with that report, it was exactly what he had to write if he intended to keep his job. To even put his fears into writing would likely send him to the department psychologist for an evaluation. Until there was more evidence to back up what he suspected, that was going to remain his own private theory. He sat for a long moment, his inner turmoil struggling against the truth. He knew full well that the truth would get him suspended. No one would believe what the tracks were telling him, what the crime scene itself was willing to tell him, hell, what his own eyes had seen for that matter. He'd had to warn Blanchard that if they told the truth of what they'd seen, they'd both be on suspension pending a psych eval. That this was no man, no mere animal, this was something beyond the reckoning of modern man. There is one person who will believe me, he thought, one person who would understand the signs. Rising to his feet, he reached for his coat that was hanging on the hook beside his desk. Slipping into a heavy wool jacket, he fished out the keys to the charger and stepped away from his desk. Where are you going? Asked Blanchard, starting to get to his feet. I can't just sit and wait for the coroner's report, said Will. I'm going to go speak with my grandfather. You need me to come with you? Asked Blanchard. Nah, replied Will. I'll call you if I learn anything. Let me know as soon as the report comes in. Will do, replied Blanchard. I don't think we're going to hear anything today. Probably be morning before the report comes out anyway. All right, if that's the case, said Will, I'll just see you when I get back to town. If anything new comes in, call me. Let's hope not, Blanchard said, shaking his head. I don't think I ever want to see another crime scene like that again. I had fucking nightmares about that thing. I still can't believe it. Me either, agreed Will. But if we don't figure this one out, I'm afraid it's just the beginning. I was afraid you were going to say that, said Blanchard. My preliminary report is in the computer, said Will, heading for the door, if the sheriff wants to look at it. Heading out the door at a quick pace, Will unlocked the charger and slid behind the wheel. He turned the key and the gear reduction starter whined but refused to catch. After the third attempt, the pitch of the whine changed and the engine roared to life. That's my girl, said Will, gently patting the steering wheel. Pulling out of the parking lot, Will didn't bother to wait for the engine to warm up completely. The temperature had risen enough that his windshield shouldn't fog over, and he wanted to get to his destination while he still had plenty of daylight. Turning onto Jefferson Avenue, he headed north before turning onto North Highway 5. This would take him back past the first crime scene, but that wasn't his destination. This time it was much further out of town. Once he hit the city limits of Lebanon, the engine temperature had come up enough to turn on the heater. As soon as he had the defrosters going, he accelerated up to 85 miles per hour. It was well above the legal speed limit, but every cop in the county knew his charger and they wouldn't bother him. Besides, it was good to knock the cobwebs out of the engine occasionally. After clearing the last big curve near Kingsbrook Road, he knew that the road didn't make many turns until the next turnoff. Mashing the accelerator to the floor, the massive Holley double-pumper carburetor responded by feeding the massive 440 cubic inch engine enough fuel to push him back into his seat. Climbing into triple digits on the speedometer, reaching quickly towards the upper limit of the gauge. Taking out his cell phone, he glanced down long enough to find the number he wanted to hit and dial. Hitting the speaker button, he tossed the phone on the seat beside him and he turned his attention back to the road. There was just enough snow on the ground to make everything look white and pristine, but the roads were clear. The phone rang twice before a tired-sounding voice picked up the line. "Hello," said the voice sleepily. "What's up, Pocket Doc?" asked Will. "It's Will Grey Eagle." "Will," said the voice, suddenly sounding more awake. "What's got you calling out of the blue like this?" "Well, it's two things, really," explained Will. "I need you to overnight me some medical kits. I used up most of my EDC and vehicle kits stopping some heavy bleeding yesterday." "Holy shit," said Doc. "What happened?" "That's the tough part to explain," replied Will. "One deputy was killed and another almost got his head taken off by this thing." "What kind of thing?" asked Doc, concern rising in his voice. "The kind I can't really talk about, Carrie," answered Will. "It's an active investigation. Just take my word that it's nothing like I've ever dealt with. It's killed at least 7 people that we know of, maybe more that we don't know about yet." "Is it some kind of animal?" asked Doc. "A bear, maybe?" "I wish I could say," said Will. "It's like nothing I've ever hunted or even heard of before. I have a bad feeling it's not going to end clean. I have to find this thing and put it down before it kills more people." "That sounds nasty," replied Doc. "Your address the same?" "Yeah," said Will. "Put it on my account and send me 10 kits, the big ones, not just an EDC." "No problem on the kits, brother," said Doc, "but your money's no good with me. You'll have your kits on the overnight. What's the second?" "I just wanted to let you know that your class saved a life last night," said Will. "If it wasn't for the classes that you gave me treating trauma, a deputy would have died. He's alive because of you." "He's alive because you paid attention," said Doc. "He's alive because of you, bromigo." "Only because of what you taught me back in Afghanistan," said Will. "I'm just happy I remembered it all." "Well, that's good to know, man," said Doc. "I'm glad it helped. I'm just happy he survived. That's why I do this. That's what Dark Angel Medical was created for, to help grunts like you save lives." "Thanks, brother," said Will. "I gotta go. I'm looking into something that might give me an edge against this thing. Give my best to Angelia." "Will do, brother," said Doc. "You be careful. If you need anything else, don't hesitate to call me." "Much appreciated, man," replied Will. "Will do, thank you." "I mean it, Will," said Doc. "Day or night, call me." "I will," he replied. With that, the line went dead. It was good to know a former combat medic who owned his own company that supplied combat medic kits and training. He knew Carrie would have those kits out to him on the next FedEx shipment on overnight delivery. In the pit of his stomach, he knew that he was going to need all the trauma kits that he could get his hands on. Concentrating on the road, he was thankful that there wasn't really any traffic out on this cold January morning. It was unusual that he got to give the old girl her legs for such a long stretch of road. Most days he was lucky to get to 100 before he had to slow down for traffic. He didn't see another vehicle at all until he was almost to Mike's Country Store. Still, it was just a matter of a slight adjustment of the wheel, and he overtook them without any effort. Slipping back into his own lane, he held the accelerator in place for about another 30 seconds, and when he topped the hill, he could see Godwin Hollow Bridge at the bottom of the other side. Letting off the accelerator, the big engine growled like a ravenous beast as it rumbled and roared its way back down to close to 60 miles per hour. As he crossed the bridge, he began applying the brakes. Clicking on the turn signal, he began slowing for the left turn onto Highway E toward Eldridge, Missouri. Since Highway E was much narrower and had more curves, he kept the speedometer closer to the actual speed limit. Slowing down at the city limits of Eldridge, he waved at a man who was exiting the little country store before making a right at the intersection where Double N Highway separates from E. Once clear of the city limits, he accelerated again and let his mind drift over the crime scene details. Will knew every twist and turn of this road and could drive it in his sleep. The gruesome images would be seared into his brain for a long time to come. It was carnage like he had not seen since Afghanistan. Every detail was relived in perfect clarity. It was one of the things he considered both a blessing and a curse. He could recall every detail of a crime scene, but he couldn't forget them either. The more horrific the incident, the greater the detail that he saw when he closed his eyes. His focus returned to the here and now, when the pavement ended and turned to gravel. Will knew that he was getting close to his destination. The map called it Bobcat Trail Road, but he'd never called it that. It was simply his grandfather's land and held a sacred place in his mind. This is where he learned about his heritage, his family history, and all the skills that made him who he was. Turning left onto what could only be called a driveway in the most rudimentary sense, he could hear the tall grass that had grown up in the center of the road rubbing against the undercarriage of the Charger. The road was only 2 trails left by the passage of tires from the infrequent usage. It was a testament of just how often his grandfather came to town. On a fence post beside the road was a no trespassing sign written in bold black letters on a yellow board. There was no point in calling ahead to let him know that he was coming. For one, grandfather didn't have a phone, and another, he would hear the exhaust on the Charger long before he reached the house. Will smiled softly at the thought of his grandfather waiting to greet him when he rounded the final bend in the road. He also knew that it would be somewhat less of a friendly welcome if he didn't recognize the sound of the approaching vehicle. Cresting a small hill, he saw the second warning sign. It read, "No trespassing. You were warned," on the same yellow board with black lettering. He knew that was the exact moment that whoever was on this road came into rifle range of his grandfather's driveway. Seconds later, he came out of the curve and the house came into view on his left. It was still solid and in great condition, considering it had been built in the mid-1950s by his grandfather and his great-uncle. Standing in the driveway was his grandfather, wearing a white button-up shirt, black leather vest, blue jeans, and knee-high brown moccasin boots, with the pants legs tucked into them. His long white hair hung loosely around his shoulders, moving with the gentle breeze. Around his waist was a brown leather gun belt with a matching holster on his right hip, holding an 1872 open-top Army Colt in .45 long. In his hand was a Winchester Yellow Boy, also in .45 long. Will was very familiar with both guns. Standing behind his grandfather was Will's cousin, Jason Otokte. Jason was dressed in moccasin boots that matched his grandfather's, but there the similarities ended. He wore black military-style fatigue pants tucked into the boots with tactical belt holding a Glock 17 on his right hip and mag pouches for 10 magazines on his left. He wore a basic black t-shirt beneath a black tactical vest with sappy plates and pouches holding extra magazines for the AR-15. Jason took a more pragmatic approach to his armaments. Pulling to a stop a few yards away from them, Will got out and approached his grandfather. Dropping the rifle to his side in his right hand, his grandfather embraced him with his left arm. "It's good to see you, Gray Eagle," said grandfather. "Thank you, grandfather," replied Will. "It's good to see you, too." Will nodded briefly at his cousin, who only returned a curt nod. "Why the heavy weapons?" Will asked, gesturing at both of them. "Are you expecting trouble?" "Not from you," replied Grandfather, smiling warmly. "I know the sound of that engine in my sleep. You still need to fix that tapping lifter." "Add it to the list," replied Will. "Now, I love this car, but it needs constant attention." "Who were you expecting trouble from, Grandfather?" "It is of no consequence," said Grandfather with a smile. "Let's eat and catch up. You haven't been out here in weeks. There will be time for such things. I have wahanpi in the crock pot and fry bread on the counter cooling." Will smiled at the thought of the food. It was good to eat with his family and be away from the processed foods of the grocery stores in town. Everything here was either grown by his grandfather and cousins or traded from one of the other groups of First Nation people that they were in contact with. "Grandfather," said Will, refocusing on the reason he was here, "I need your help." "It can't wait until we've eaten?" asked Grandfather. "As much as I'm looking forward to your wahanpi, I need to tell you something, and I need your advice. This is beyond anything I've ever seen." "Fine, fine," agreed Grandfather, smiling. "Jason, will you pour us some coffee and meet us on the deck?" "Of course, Grandfather," replied Jason with a quick nod at Will. While Jason went inside to pour the coffee, Will and his grandfather walked around the porch to where the chairs sat overlooking the Niangua River Valley. In moments, Jason joined them carrying 3 large mugs of steaming coffee. Will knew it would be strong and black the way his grandfather always insisted coffee should be. "By Lamea," said Will, accepting his offered cup. Jason smiled and didn't reply. "It is good to hear you using the language of your people," said Grandfather. "I worry about you. If you insist on being an officer, you should join the tribal police. Make a difference for your own people." "I understand, Grandfather," replied Will, "but something has always drawn me here. I have felt it since I was a boy. Besides, I've got no desire to move to the Lakota Res. North Dakota is beautiful, but my heart's here." Grandfather seemed to ponder his words as he sipped his coffee. Will took the opportunity to take a sip of his own. There was an unusual flavor to his grandfather's coffee that he could not find anywhere else. "One day you will tell me how it is your coffee is like no other I've ever had," said Will, smiling at his grandfather. "Perhaps," said Grandfather, smiling mischievously, "but it will not be today." Will and Jason both chuckled at the long-running joke in the family. They also knew that their grandfather would likely take the secret to his grave. "Before I begin," said Will, his tone growing serious, "why are you both so heavily armed? It's not unusual to see you armed, but wearing armor and carrying heavier weapons than normal? What's going on?" "I've been having dark dreams of late," replied Grandfather. "I hear the whispers in the breeze. Something evil has awoken. I can sense its presence, although I do not think it has sensed mine." "What do you think it is?" asked Will. "I do not know," replied Grandfather, looking suddenly very tired. "There's more," added Jason. "I've been hearing some strange shit from people that live over toward Bennett Springs." "Like what?" asked Will, turning to face Jason directly. "Unexplained movement in the woods," said Jason. "Game animals acting like a major predator in this area, even when you can't see any signs. Tom Eccles said that something tried to get into his house one night." "What?" asked Will. "Did it try to break down the door?" "That's the weird part," explained Jason. "Tom's big Rottweiler whined and hid in the closet, and then something started turning the doorknob." "What did he do?" said Will, frowning. "He worked the pump on his shotgun and yelled at whoever it was that they better get out of there before he opened fire," replied Jason. "Well, then what happened?" asked Will. "Well, that's the weird part," said Jason, a dark look forming on his face. Tom said something growled really deep and low. He said the hair on his neck and arms stood up when the growl seemed to turn into laughter as it walked away. What did he do after that? Asked Will, dreading the answer. He called me, said Jason. I took Grandfather over to his house and he performed a blessing way to keep the skinwalkers away from his home. It came back anyway. A skinwalker, said Will, frowning. We're a long way from Navajo territory. Do not speak that word, cautioned Grandfather. That is something not to be said carelessly. You can bring them down on you by giving power to their name. Many among the tribes share that same belief, not just the Navajo. Our people, the Lakota, have a different name for them, as do your father's people. The Lakota and the Cheyenne called upon those spirits when they became the first dog soldiers. None of them should be called upon so recklessly. That is ancient dark magic not to be underestimated. So you're convinced it's not a... Will trailed off, not sure if he should say the name. The blessing way would keep them away, assured the Grandfather. And since it did not, then we are dealing with something else. I do not know what it could be. Well, then I have something to tell you, said Will, his face growing dark. Will spent the next several minutes telling them of the crime scenes, leaving out nothing. He even made sure to relay all the details he learned from Mrs. Bennett. His grandfather and Jason listened intently to every detail and waited until Will finished before they spoke. That's some crazy shit, said Jason, shaking his head. That was the exact description the woman gave of the creature? Asked Grandfather. And the one you saw was the same? Yes, Grandfather, replied Will, every detail. There are many different tales that might explain what you describe, explained Grandfather. Not all of them are from our people. Europeans called it a werewolf. Settlers in the wilds of this country called it the dog man. There are other names, but they all share common themes. How do I stop it? Asked Will. To know that, said Grandfather, you will have to discover exactly what type of creature you're dealing with. There are many legends. We shot it several times and I never found a blood trail, added Will. Are you sure you hit it? Asked Jason, frowning. I'm sure, replied Will angrily. I could see the impacts on the fur. No offense, cousin, replied Jason. I didn't mean anything bad. I know I'd be shaking if I saw something like that. I doubt I'd be very calm. I didn't have time to be scared, replied Will. It had just killed one deputy and was heading for the second. I had to act without hesitation. You shot it? Asked Grandfather. You're certain of that? Yes, said Will. We all did. Then I'm afraid that it will come for you, said Grandfather. If this is a dark spirit, then it will want your blood for hurting it. But I didn't see any blood, said Will. It didn't do any damage. None that you saw, answered Grandfather. Even powerful creatures can be wounded. If it has your scent, it will come for you. You need to be ready. What can I do to prepare? Asked Will. I will make strong medicine for you, said Grandfather. Wear the medicine pouch at all times. It should help to hide you from this creature. And if that doesn't work, added Jason, I'll hook you up with something that hits a little harder than that shotgun of yours. What have you got? Will asked, turning to face Jason. Just don't fucking ask where I got it, Jason replied, tossing the rest of his coffee off the porch and onto the ground below. Wouldn't dream of it, answered Will, watching as Jason walked into the house. Let's eat, said Grandfather, standing and finishing off his coffee with one long pull. Will followed him inside but turned around at the last moment before entering the house. He had the distinct feeling that something was watching him. Slowly he scanned the trees but saw nothing. And still the feeling lingered, like the cold stiffness in your bones when you've been out in the snow for too long. Shifting his gaze slowly from shadow to shadow, he narrowed down the area from where the feeling seemed to be the strongest. There, in the deep shadows of the trees, he thought he could see a darker outline among the shadows. He could almost make out the faint yellow eyes, and then in an instant it was gone, leaving only the sinister feeling of lingering malice. Somehow the beast had found him. Stepping inside, he slid the glass door shut and latched it. Once inside, the feeling vanished like smoke on the wind. Will knew it was because of his grandfather. He had placed a powerful protection on his home. Not even this creature, whatever it was, could break through without tremendous effort. "Here," Jason said, tossing Will a rifle. "Check this out." Although it looked like a normal AR-style rifle upon first glance, he instantly noticed that the barrel was much larger than standard. It also had an optic that had both low light and thermal options. "It's a .50 caliber," explained Jason. "They call it Beowulf. I'll hook you up with some ammo for it that will really pack a fucking punch. If this thing doesn't knock that bitch down, then I don't have anything that can." Sliding the door open again, he brought the rifle to his shoulder and turned on the optic. He began scanning the trees, but there was nothing there. It was gone, assuming it was ever there in the first place. Will believed his grandfather's warning, but he also knew that he had driven here at close to 100 miles per hour in some places. There was no way that an animal, or anything else for that matter, had kept up with him without him seeing it. Quickly, he checked the magazine and found it was loaded with what appeared to be tungsten-tipped armor-piercing rounds. Slapping the magazine back into the receiver, he pulled the charging handle and chambered around. "I'll be right back," said Will, heading out the door. "The fuck you will," replied Jason, grabbing another rifle and following right behind him. "If you think that thing is out there, then you ain't going alone, cuz." Taking the steps down from the deck, two at a time, Will brought the rifle up into the high-ready position and began advancing on the spot where he'd felt the creature's presence. He could only barely hear Jason moving along beside him. Even though Jason had never joined the military, his woodcraft skills were every bit as good as any ranger that Will had ever known. Sweeping continually from side to side, he kept watching every angle of approach. He knew without looking that Jason was doing the same thing, covering their backs. After 30 yards into the woods, he knew he was nearing the spot where he felt the presence. Although there was nothing there now, he could see impressions in the leaf litter indicating something had been there recently. "It was here," said Will, kneeling to inspect the tracks. "Well, it's not very far away," added Jason. "We need to get back to the house." Looking up, Will saw that Jason was looking up into the canopy of the trees. Following his gaze, he could see the claw marks on the trunk of the big oak, where the creature had climbed rapidly into the large branches above them. There was an almost Stygian darkness in the branches above them. "It's in the trees," added Jason, his voice barely a whisper. Even though winter was upon them, the canopy was thick with old-growth trees, whose branches intertwined, forming an almost impenetrable thatched roof above their heads. Only the faint glimpse of the sky above could be seen through the thick tangle of limbs. In that occasional beam of light, they could see the shadow of movement of something big moving swiftly through the darkness, a deeper darkness within the darkness. "Let's move," whispered Will, bringing up the rifle and beginning to back toward the house. Moving quickly, they headed toward the light of the clear yard beside the house. They could hear movement in the trees above them coming closer and gaining speed. Will turned and began moving backward, covering them with Beowulf. Jason grabbed Will by the back of the shirt to guide him and keep him from running into a tree. Will took a quick aim at the movement near a large elm and he fired. The roar of Beowulf shattered the stillness of the forest, echoing off down the river valley like the dying resonances of a thunderstorm. He saw bark fly from the trunk of the tree, but nothing more. And then movement to his right caught his eye, and he snap-fired, taking another massive gouge out of a large walnut tree. Again, the powerful roar of the Beowulf roared off into the distance. "There's more than one," shouted Will. "How many?" called Jason without slowing down. "I don't know, but they're gaining on us." They could both hear the scrabbling sound of claws moving along the rough tree trunks above them. And although he couldn't count the sounds, he knew it was more than two. They were funneling them to a choke point just inside the trees. Realization dawned on both men that they weren't going to make it to the house. From the house behind them, they both heard the sharp chuck-chuck of a lever-action rifle, followed by a thunderous report of a large caliber round, and it thundered through the trees like a massive fist smashing through the branches. And above them, Will heard a grunt of pain, followed by a roar of rage. The roar was so loud that he could feel it in his chest. It was a primal roar, causing the primitive part of his brain to rebel in near panic. On the wind, they heard Grandfather chanting in Lakota. To punctuate his words, they heard the lever of the big rifle again, followed by another massive boom. And this time, there was a shriek of pain from high in the trees. Instantly, the scrabbling of claws ceased, and the woods went dead silent. Seconds later, they emerged from the trees, panting from exertion, and sweat ran down Will's face in thick drops, dripping from his chin onto the stock of the Beowulf. Both men kept their rifles at the ready as they backed up to the stairs leading onto the deck. Will glanced up to see his grandfather holding the old Sharp's buffalo rifle that had once belonged to his great-great-grandfather. Standing there with the wind blowing his long white hair streaming behind him and the fierce look of determination on his face, Will had little trouble remembering that his grandfather had once been a soldier too. He still had the look of a warrior despite his age. There was a reason that the name J. Matoshik was still spoken reverently among both Cherokee and the Lakota. "I think maybe we should all go inside," said Grandfather. "That song will not keep them away for long." Chapter 8. Wahanpi and Fry Bread. When you were born, you cried and the world rejoiced. Live your life so that when you die, the world cries and you rejoice. Cherokee. They watched the windows and the doors nervously for a while before Grandfather cradled his Sharp's buffalo rifle and nodded solemnly. "They're gone," he said with a relieved sigh. "Thank you, Great Spirit," added Jason. "Grandfather, what are those things?" "They are much as I feared," replied Grandfather. "They are the whispered tales of the campfires of my own grandfather and his grandfather before him. The white settlers called it the Dog Man. The Cherokee call it the Alonga Doglala, the long dog or the spirit with knife teeth." "I thought those were just children's stories," said Will, still watching the trees. "No one wants to believe in the darkness until the sun sets," answered Grandfather, easing himself into an old wooden rocking chair. "How do we stop them?" Will asked, still not turning away from the window. The big rifle was still gripped tightly in his hands. "The old tales say that they were to be avoided at all costs," said Grandfather, shaking his head. "I haven't heard any tales of them being killed. I don't even know if it's possible." "It's a physical creature," said Will, glancing at his grandfather. "It can be killed." "My grandfather said that nothing they used worked," said Grandfather. "Your grandfather didn't have a Beowulf," said Jason, holding up his rifle. "Are you certain that'll work?" asked Grandfather. "If I can get a clear shot," added Will, "I'm going to find out." "Be careful what you wish for," said Grandfather. "You might just get the opportunity." "I have the distinct feeling that this is going to happen whether I want it to or not," said Will. "Well, let us not dwell on this," said Grandfather. "Let us eat and give our thanks to the Great Spirit for delivering us from the Olonga Doglala." While Grandfather began serving large bowls of wahampi that had an intoxicating aroma, Jason began setting out a large platter of fry bread with fresh butter and honey, with the comb still in the jar. Will took a seat at the table that still allowed him to watch the sliding glass door that led onto the deck. Setting the large ceramic bowl in front of Will, Grandfather smiled and patted him on the cheek. "You still don't trust the medicine of our people," he said, chuckling softly. "They are gone, Gray Eagle. They will not return here." "But they will return," replied Will, glancing up and frowning. "Yes," agreed Grandfather. "They have all of our sense now, but they will not try it here. The protections of this place are too strong for them." "Are you certain?" asked Jason, sliding into his seat. "As certain as I can be," answered Grandfather. "They will not try it, but they are patient. They will wait until we leave this place before they try again." "Great," muttered Will. "Let us enjoy this meal and concern ourselves with the rest afterwards," said Grandfather. "Wahanpi is best while it's still hot." After the blessing was given, Will began sipping the broth from the wahanpi. It was rich and full of flavor, strong with the herbs and spices that his grandfather grew in his garden. He could taste the garlic and the wild sage, but there were other subtle flavors there that he could not place. Grandfather's wahanpi was an ever-evolving recipe, and it got better each time he tasted it. "It's very good," said Will, nodding his approval. "It would be better if the buffalo had not been frozen," replied Grandfather. "Unfortunately, that was all I had." "I couldn't tell," said Will, smiling. "Are we seriously going to talk about the freaking wahanpi after what we just saw?" said Jason, his voice raised with emotion. "What the hell are we going to do about those things?" "We do know that a big enough bullet will hurt them," said Will, taking another spoonful of the wahanpi. "Without having the body of one to study," began Grandfather, "I can only guess about them, but I might have an idea. I think that they have a heavier muscular and bone structure than we do. That would explain why small bullets didn't seem to do much damage. It's clear that they aren't wearing armor," added Will, "unless they have something hidden under their fur. Or they just heal really fast," added Jason. "That is a possibility," said Grandfather. "Perhaps they are just very difficult to injure." "Then we should plan on doing a lot of damage," said Will. "Jason, do you have any tracers for the Beowulf?" "No, but I know where to get 'em," answered Jason. "I'll get you some. How many are you thinking?" "Well, how many can you get?" asked Will, shrugging. "Probably a couple of 100, said Jason. "Maybe more, depending on how much you have to spend." "I'll cover the cost," said Grandfather. "Fair enough," said Jason. "I'll get a hold of my contacts." "Get some hollow points, too," added Will, "and maybe some armor-piercing rounds." "I'll grab a little bit of everything he's got," said Jason. "We'll try it all. Surely something will hurt these damn things." "I want to do more than just hurt 'em," Will said, frowning. "One step at a time, grandson," chided Grandfather. "We must first learn how to hurt them more than we've done so far." "Well, I'm not ruling anything out," said Will. "I'm willing to try just about anything at this point." "What about silver?" asked Jason. "I know that's a werewolf legend, but what the hell, right?" "I think we could drip some silver into the hollow points," replied Will. "That shouldn't take too much effort. I think I have some silver jewelry that I won't miss." "While you two decide what ammunition to use," said Grandfather, "I'm going downstairs to put together a spirit bag for you. It should help keep them from tracking you." "Well, thank you, Grandfather," said Will. Jason used Will's cell phone and began making calls to his contacts, locating the required items. By the time it had all been secured, Grandfather returned from the basement carrying 3 small leather bags that were dangling from long leather straps. Handing one to Will and one to Jason, he slipped his own around his neck. "These bags control strong medicine," explained Grandfather. "It will make it difficult for them to track you over distance. If they see you or find your scent, the medicine will not help. You must be careful and remain alert." Will and Jason nodded and slipped theirs around their necks. Slipping his beneath his shirt, Will adjusted the thong and double-checked the knot. "Thank you, Grandfather," he said. "Yeah, thank you," added Jason. "I hope this helps." "It will," reassured Grandfather. "But to what extent is the question. Avoiding them until we are prepared to face them is still our best option." Jason held up one thumb and then began speaking quietly into the cell phone as he slipped out of the room. Will spent the next few minutes packing a duffel bag with gear that Jason had laid out for him. The Beowulf remained on the table. After the bag was loaded, he disassembled the Beowulf and cleaned it thoroughly. By the time Jason returned, Will was working the charging handle on the rifle and checking the ejection port. Once he was satisfied, he put a fresh magazine in the lower receiver and locked the bolt to the rear and then closed the dust cover. "You can pick up everything you need on your way back to town," explained Jason. "Stop by Jim McMaster's place on your way through Eldridge. He'll have it all waiting for you there." "Do I need to bring any of it back for you?" asked Will. "We're good here," replied Jason. "I have plenty of ammo for my rifle, and we've got a few thousand rounds for that Sharps. I think they defended the Alamo with less ammo than we have on hand." "Didn't they lose at the Alamo?" asked Will, smiling. "Well, yeah," said Jason, "but they didn't have Grandfather on the Sharps. He could hit an elk in the eye at 500 yards. "Don't worry about us," said Grandfather. "Be more worried about getting back to town without running into them. And once you make it to town, you shouldn't have to worry. They won't risk exposing themselves." "If they are that difficult to kill, then why, brother?" asked Jason. "Difficult, yes," replied Grandfather, "but impossible, no. They haven't lived this long by being stupid. They know that in enough numbers, humans can and will kill them. That's why they only attack in small groups or lone travelers, only ones that cannot fight back." "Move fast and don't stop for anything," said Jason. "Use that big engine for what it was made for." "Got it," said Will, shouldering the bag and picking up the Beowulf. "We'll walk you to the car," said Grandfather, picking up the Sharps and chambering around. It was beginning to snow as they walked out the back door toward the parked Charger. The air was crisp, and Will noted that the usual sounds of the woods were missing. No birds or other small animals, only the sound of the wind that whispered through the barren limbs of the leafless trees. "They have not gone far," said Grandfather, glancing around slowly. "They watch us even now." "Then I shouldn't waste any time," said Will, tossing the bag into the passenger seat and climbing into the Charger. The starter caught on the second try, and the big engine rumbled to life. Will considered letting the engine warm up for a few minutes, but thought better of it. Waving at his grandfather and Jason, and then slid the transmission into reverse to back up enough to allow him room to turn around. And seconds later, he was heading down the driveway, accelerating as fast as he safely could on the loose gravel road. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see movement in the trees on both sides of the road. They were pacing him, but he knew that once he hit the highway, they wouldn't be able to keep up. On the right side of the road, he saw movement as a large tree began to fall toward the road. Punching the accelerator to the floor, he shot under the tree just enough to clear it before it blocked the road completely. He could hear the scraping as the branches struck the back of the car, undoubtedly scratching the paint on the trunk and the fenders. Seconds later, he was on the gravel road and leaving the driveway behind him. This road, although still gravel, was far too wide to be blocked by a single tree. He could still see movement in the trees as the creatures moved to keep up with him, but he was fast approaching the pavement. As soon as all four tires were on the pavement, he pushed the accelerator to the floor. The big engine roared and rocketed the old Charger to almost 70 miles an hour in seconds. The road had enough curves that he didn't dare push it much harder than that, so he backed off the throttle. He glanced into the side mount mirrors, and he could see that his pursuers were falling farther and farther behind by the second. And blowing out a breath that he didn't realize he'd been holding, he concentrated on the road ahead and kept the speed up as fast as he could safely go. He knew that he had to bear in mind the number of curves and the occasional deer that wandered into the road this far out in the country. Fortunately, he didn't see any deer on this trip. By the time he reached the small town of Eldridge, he slowed down and pulled into the driveway of the little country store. Jim McMasters lived right behind the store and was waiting by his pickup as Will slowed to a stop. "Pop the trunk," said McMasters, lowering his tailgate on his old Ford pickup. Will shut the engine down and climbed out, walking around to the back and unlocking the trunk with the key. Making room for the large boxes that McMasters had in the pickup, he shoved his medical kit and duty bag up toward the back seat, and in seconds McMasters had loaded several large boxes into the trunk. "That should do it," said McMasters as Will shut the trunk. "What do you guys need this much heavy ammo for? I mean, shit, you could take out a goddamn herd of buffalo with all this." "Well, it's something like that," said Will. "What do we owe you for all this?" "Well, not a damn thing," said McMasters. "Tell your grandfather that it's the least I can do. I owe him a hell of a lot more than this." Will considered asking what he owed his grandfather, but thought better of it. "All right, well, thank you," said Will, shaking McMasters' hand. "I'll let him know." "I don't know what you guys are hunting," said McMasters, "but if you need more, just let me know. It might take a few days to round it up. Not a lot of call for big rounds like this." "Go ahead and get more," said Will, after a moment's thought. "I have a bad feeling that we're going to need it." "Does this have anything to do with those 2 deputies that were attacked a few miles away from here?" asked McMasters. "How did you know about that?" Will asked, suddenly concerned. "Well, word travels fast out here in the boonies," explained McMasters. "Besides that, my wife's sister is married to a Cameron County detective named Weddle. He told us to keep our pets indoors at night and not to let the kids play in the woods. He said that there was some kind of animal attacking people." "Yeah," agreed Will. "You might let people know that it would be best if they did the same. And keep your guns loaded, too." "We'll do that," said McMasters. "I had a feeling something was up. The animals have been acting strange lately. Haven't seen a deer or a turkey in almost a week. That's damn unusual around here. Also, the dogs have been getting under the porch at night and whining, and that all points to a big predator in the area. You have any idea what it is?" "I'm not sure what it is," said Will, frowning, "but they aren't afraid to attack people, so be careful." "Will do," agreed McMasters. "You too." "That's the plan," replied Will, getting back into the Charger. Will fired up the engine, and McMasters tapped on the window. Rolling it down, Will glanced up to see what he needed. "I'll have the ammo and the other gear in a few days," he explained. "I'll send word to Jason when it's ready to pick up." "Thanks again," said Will. McMasters only nodded and then turned and headed into his house, casting a nervous glance at the tree line not 50 yards from his back door. Will glanced at the tree line as well, almost expecting to see movement. Only the still, cold breeze stirred in those woods. Not so much as a squirrel broke the eerie silence. He backed out of the driveway and turned back onto the highway and sped off toward Lebanon. And part of him wanted to turn around and go back to his grandfather's house and face the beast there. He knew that the creatures would follow him wherever he went. It was him that they were after. He knew that the only chance they had to stop them was to find their lair and take them all out. He just hoped that he had enough firepower to finish the job. More lives depended on it. These things wouldn't stop killing until they were forced to stop. The real question was why? If these things had been around for centuries, why would they start attacking people now? What brought them out of hiding? And more importantly, why had they lost their fear of man? A more frightening question came to him then. What if they had been here all along and no one knew that many of the missing persons around here had been taken as prey? You are listening to Apex Predator, Wolf Moon. Written by D.A. Roberts. Read to you by Cameron Buckner. Print copyright by Douglas Roberts. Audio production copyright by Cameron Buckner. Reproduction of this audio in any way is prohibited by U.S. copyright laws without written approval. Stay tuned to the Dixie Cryptid channel, codename Wild Hunt, Operation Blood Eagle.